Well, just 1 week after the anniversary of the 1989 Exxon Valdez spill that is considered one of the most devastating environmental disasters in history, the oil company is at it again. And this one is much closer to home. An ExxonMobil pipeline actually ruptured on Friday, leaking nearly 10,000 barrels of tar sands crude into the small Alaska town, or excuse me, Arkansas town. The streets flowed with black gold.
Luckily, our house is here, which is seemingly unaffected, but the smell is unbelievable. I mean, look. Incredible. And that is oil.
22 homes were evacuated when the 848-mile-long Pegasus pipeline burst. This line carries around 90,000 barrels of crude oil from Illinois to Texas every day, but that flow has temporarily stopped. And this isn't the only issue that ExxonMobil is dealing with. Last Wednesday, a train that was reportedly to be carrying tar sands between states actually spilled nearly 15,000 gallons in Minnesota. For more on this story, I'm joined now by Anthony Swift. He's an attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Hi there, Anthony. Thanks for joining us. So this leak obviously pales in comparison with anything that we saw in 1989, with anything that we saw during the BP Gulf Coast spill, but it's in people's backyards, so it's much more present. Can you talk about what kind of impact that could possibly have on how people see this spill?
Well, oftentimes spills do happen in remote areas where, people don't see the impacts. But the reality is, with many of these pipelines, they're now in people's backyards and they don't even know it. And I think that, you look at those pictures, what happened in Arkansas really does show the true risks of some of these pipelines. And I would say that, particularly tar sands pipelines, we found that, pipelines carrying tar sands crude are more susceptible to rupture. The pipelines that have carried them in the northern Midwest have spilled, over 3.5 times as much crude as the American average per pipeline mile.
And why is that?
Well, one of the reasons is tar sands is physically different from conventional crude. I think most people wouldn't recognize it as crude if they saw it in the field. It's basically a tarry, semi-solid substance that has to be mixed with, volatile, toxic natural gas liquids to move in a pipeline, but it's still very thick, has to be moved at high pressures and high temperatures. Those temperatures cause corrosion to increase at a much more rapid rate. And once it spills the other side of this, and we found this out with the Kalamazoo spill in Michigan just 3 years ago, the natural gas liquids gas off, and that leaves the heavy tar sands bitumen to sink in water bodies. And right now there's no way to really deal with spills involving bitumen that sinks. Kalamazoo, nearly 3 years later, has cost nearly $1 billion for cleanup, and 38 miles of that river are still contaminated.
Wow, those are pretty overwhelming numbers. Now, how likely is this spill to change anything, or will it? I mean, obviously, whenever a spill of any magnitude happens, there's some type of liability. The oil company comes in and they clean it up. They also pay reparations, but it doesn't really seem to ever draw the kind of conclusions that we want.
Well, yes. I mean, when it comes to these spills, oftentimes the oil companies are insured, and their liability is capped by federal law. One of the interesting things is the liability system is run by a government fund, and tar sands doesn't even pay into this fund. So often the money used to pay for these spills aren't contributed by the movement of tar sands. But I think that given the fact that big pipeline projects are currently under public scrutiny, pipeline projects like Keystone XL, keeping in mind that the Pegasus pipeline was about 1/10 the size of Keystone XL, this should factor into that public debate, because it's a tragic warning of what could happen with these major high-capacity tar sands pipelines.
And let's talk about the Keystone XL pipeline. I mean, last week the U.S. Senate held a more or less symbolic vote in favor of the Keystone XL pipeline. It's obviously something that we've been fighting for quite some time in terms of the U.S. What could this potentially mean for environmental safety?
Well, I think that it really shows the American public what the risks of tar sands pipelines are. I mean, right now, most Americans think this is a conventional oil pipeline bringing oil to the United States. But the reality is it's moving a substance that's dramatically different, has increased risks, and it's actually moving this tar sands not to the United States, but through it in order to get it to the Gulf Coast, where millions of barrels a day of refined product are exported to the international market. So it's really not a pipeline that's in the American interest. We don't need the oil, and certainly we don't need to provide a thoroughfare for Canadians to export their oil internationally, particularly when the risk is borne by American communities and on American water resources.
That's surprising that they're exporting it using a pipeway that would go basically through the U.S., not importing it, as many of those places, as many of the commercials, the ads that surround the Keystone XL pipeline actually advertise. So finally, let's talk about the difference between, or is there any differences between the practices that ExxonMobil uses versus other companies? Can we expect a leak, a small leak or a large leak to happen from any company?
Unfortunately, yes. When you look at the pipeline safety standards, many of them really do protect the worst performers. And, you know, we have over 100 leaks a year. Particularly, as I said, we've seen more leaks on tar sands pipelines, but even the conventional pipeline system has got some major problems. And, you know, as time goes on, we're seeing significant gaps in pipeline safety when it comes to maintaining pipelines, building safe pipelines, and detecting leaks when they happen. I think with the Arkansas pipeline, you had a very large leak that was detected by residents and not the company. And that is most often what happens. 19 out of 20 spills are detected by landowners and not sophisticated leak detection systems. And of course, that's a major problem.
Very interesting, and luckily this time only 22 houses were actually affected. Who knows the next time? Anthony Swith, attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council, thank you so much for joining us.
It was a pleasure to be on, Megan. Thank you.